Welcome back to Grace Over Guilt. I'm Dan Kaufman. We've reached the part of the story where everything slows down. After the chaos of the arrest, the sentencing, and the divorce papers, there's this long stretch where not much happens externally, but everything happens internally. Today I want to tell you about the long wait, the months in jail where I had nothing but time. Time to think, time to fall apart, and eventually, time to start putting the pieces back together. The weight of time. People who haven't been incarcerated don't understand what time does to you in there. On the outside, time flies. You're busy. You're distracted. Days blur into weeks, which blur into months. You look up, and somehow it's October, and you're not sure what happened to July. In jail, time stretches. Every hour feels like 3. Every day feels like a week, and you have nothing to do but think. At first, I thought the time would be productive. I'd read, I'd journal, I'd work on myself, I'd come out better than I went in. I had this vision of emerging transformed, like some kind of enlightened monk who had used his incarceration as a spiritual retreat. That's not what happened. Not at first, anyway. What happened first was that I fell apart. The depression. I had been told I wouldn't serve any jail time. My attorney had been clear about that. And then I was sentenced to 8 months. That gap between what I expected and what I got was devastating. It wasn't just disappointment, it was a fundamental rupture in how I understood reality. If my attorney was wrong about this, what else was he wrong about? If the system could do this to me, what else could it do? I fell into a depression unlike anything I'd experienced before. It wasn't just sadness. It was this heavy gray fog that settled over everything. Colors looked muted. Food tasted like cardboard. I had no motivation. I had no hope. I had no ability to imagine a future worth living. I remember one specific day. It was maybe 3 weeks in. I woke up, looked at the ceiling, and realized I couldn't think of a single reason to get out of my bunk. Not one. The day stretched ahead of me like an empty highway with no destination. I lay there for what must have been 2 hours, just staring at the same spot on the concrete above me, watching the light slowly shift. And then the divorce papers came, 13 days in, and my wife had filed. The depression got worse. My wife was gone. My marriage was over. My daughters were growing up without me, and I had no idea if they'd ever want a relationship with me again. There were days when the thoughts got dark, really dark. Days when I replayed every mistake, every wrong turn, every moment where I could have done something different. Days when the shame was so thick I couldn't breathe. Depression lies to you. It tells you that this is permanent. It tells you that you deserve this. It tells you that there's no point in trying because nothing will ever get better. And when you're in it, you believe it. The lies feel more true than anything else. Discovering the anxiety. One thing I discovered in jail was that I had been an anxious person my entire life without realizing it. The constant worry, the what ifs, the way my mind would spin out worst case scenarios at 2 a.m., the tightness in my chest before important meetings, the way I'd replay conversations for hours, analyzing every word. I had thought that was just normal. I thought everyone lived like that. In jail, without all the distractions of normal life, the anxiety became impossible to ignore. On the outside, I could outrun it. I could work 16-hour days. I could fill every moment with activity. I could numb it with busyness. But in a cell, there's nowhere to run. There's nothing to do. The anxiety sits there with you, like an uninvited guest who won't leave. I could feel it physically, the tightness in my chest that never went away. The racing thoughts made it impossible to sleep. The way my heart would pound when I heard footsteps in the hallway, wondering if it was bad news. The inability to relax even when there was literally nothing to do. I talked to the medical staff about it. They asked me questions, and I realized for the first time that what I'd been experiencing wasn't normal. It wasn't just being stressed. It was clinical anxiety that had probably been running in the background for decades. I got on medication, and let me tell you, that was a game changer. The quiet mind. I remember the first morning I woke up after the medication had fully kicked in. It took a couple of weeks to build up in my system. And then one day I just felt different. The best way I can describe it is this. Imagine you've lived your entire life next to a highway. Cars rushing by, horns honking, the constant roar of engines. You've gotten so used to it that you don't even hear it anymore. It's just the background noise of your existence. And then one day, the highway closes. That's what it felt like. For the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to have a quiet mind. The constant background noise of worry, the endless loop of what ifs, the racing thoughts that I had assumed were just part of being human, they dimmed. Not disappeared completely, but dimmed enough that I could think. I sat on the edge of my bunk that morning and almost cried, not from sadness, but from relief. So this is what other people feel like, I thought. This is what it feels like to not be constantly afraid. Getting on that medication was one of the best decisions I made in jail. It gave me enough mental space to actually do the work I needed to do on myself. Before, I was just treading water, trying not to drown. After, I could actually start swimming towards something. The self-reflection, once the worst of the depression lifted and the anxiety was managed, I started to use that time differently. I started to actually think. Not just ruminate, but think. There's a difference. Ruminating is when you replay the same painful scenes over and over, changing nothing, learning nothing, just marinating in your own regret. Thinking is when you step back and try to understand why things happened the way they did. I thought about my marriage, not just about what my wife had done wrong, but about what I had done wrong, the ways I hadn't been present, the ways I had prioritized work over connection, the half-truths I had told because I was afraid of how the full truth would land. I thought about the nights where I was downstairs in my office until 11 p.m. or alter because I was closing a deal, when really I just didn't want to face the tension waiting for me. I thought about the vacations where I spent half the time on my phone or on my laptop, physically present but mentally somewhere else. I thought about all the times she tried to talk to me about something important, and I brushed it off because I was tired or stressed or just not in the mood. I thought about my identity, how much of who I was had been tied to being successful, being productive, being the guy who had it together. And I started to ask, who am I when all of that is stripped away? Who is Dan when there's no business to run, no family to provide for, no achievements to point to? I didn't have great answers to those questions at first, but asking them was the beginning of something new. The deconstruction, there's this process that happens when you lose everything. Some people call it rock bottom. Some call it a dark night of the soul. I call it deconstruction. Everything I thought I knew about myself had to be taken apart and examined. The beliefs I had about what made me valuable. The stories I told myself about why I did what I did. The identity I had constructed over 40-some years of living. Some of it was worth keeping. Some of it wasn't. I realized that I had tied my self-worth so tightly to external achievements that I had no internal foundation. When the achievements went away, I went away with them. That wasn't sustainable, that wasn't healthy, that had to change. I realized that I had been running from discomfort my entire life. Working too much so I didn't have to sit with my thoughts. Staying busy so I didn't have to feel my feelings. Achieving so I didn't have to ask myself if I was actually happy. In that cell, there was nowhere left to run. I had to sit with all of it, the discomfort, the fear, the shame, the grief. And slowly, painfully, I learned that I could survive those feelings. They wouldn't kill me. They were just feelings. That process, the deconstruction of everything I thought I knew about myself, was painful. But it was necessary because the person I had been wasn't working. The strategies I had used weren't serving me. If I was going to build a new life, I had to build a new foundation first. The shame and remorse, I've talked about the difference between shame and guilt before, and this is where that lesson came from. I had so much shame during those months. Shame about being in jail, shame about my marriage ending, shame about not being there for my daughters, shame about the way I had handled the legal situation, Shame about being the kind of person who ends up in a place like this. But I also had genuine remorse. I genuinely felt bad for the things I had done wrong. Not the crime I didn't commit, but the choices I had made that contributed to where I ended up. The lies I told myself, the lies I told my wife, the trust I placed in the wrong people without questioning. The work was separating the shame from the remorse. Feeling bad about what I did, that was productive. That pointed toward things I could actually change. Feeling bad about who I am, that was destructive. That just kept me stuck in a loop of self-hatred that went nowhere. I'm not going to pretend I mastered that distinction in jail. I didn't. I'm still working on it, but I started to understand it. And that understanding was crucial for what came next. The slow rebuild somewhere around month 4, something shifted. I started reading differently, not just to escape, but to learn. Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, the Stoics became my teachers. Their words, written 2,000 years ago, spoke directly to my situation. They had faced exile, imprisonment, loss of everything they held dear, and they had found ways to maintain their dignity, their purpose, their humanity. I started journaling every day, not just venting, but actually processing. Writing down my thoughts forced me to organize them. It forced me to articulate what I was feeling instead of just drowning in it. I started praying again, not the transactional prayers of my past, the please give me this prayers, real prayer, honest prayer, the kind where you sit in silence and just try to listen. I started to see my time in jail not as a punishment but as a pause, a forced stop in a life that had been moving too fast in the wrong direction. Maybe I needed this. Maybe I wouldn't have stopped any other way. That reframe didn't make it easy. It didn't make it pleasant, but it made it meaningful, and meaning is what gets you through. The long wait ends. That's the long wait. 8 months of time moving slowly, thoughts moving fast, and a slow transformation happening underneath the surface. I went into jail as someone who thought he had it figured out. I came out as someone who knew he didn't, but who was finally willing to figure it out for real. The guy who walked in was confident, successful, and completely lost. The guy who walked out was uncertain, humbled, and finally pointed in the right direction. Next time, I'll tell you about walking out with nothing. Release day. The terrifying freedom of starting over with no home, no marriage, and no clear path forward. If you're in your own long wait right now, if you're in a season where everything feels slow and painful and endless, I want you to know that the work you're doing matters. Even when you can't see the progress, even when it feels like nothing is changing, something is shifting underneath the surface. The long wait is where the real transformation happens, not in the dramatic moments, in the quiet ones, in the hours that stretch into days that stretch into months, in the slow, unglamorous work of becoming someone new. Grace over guilt.